All right, y'all. This is a little bit more of what we talked about today with fractions and 1 and 2 step equations. So, as you can see, we've got a couple right here. 3/7 plus a equals 4/7. So we're going to treat this just like we would any other one-step equation. So the first step is going to be isolating a and subtracting 3/7 from both sides. So we get a equals 4/7 minus 3/7. To add or subtract fractions, you may remember from your Edpuzzles, you must have a common denominator. That means that the number on the bottom of both of them is the same. So they both have a common denominator of 7. So then you take your operation, addition or subtraction, in this case subtraction, and apply it to just the numerators. So you say 4 minus 3 is 1, and then your common denominator is 7. So your answer is A equals 1/7. For the next one, why don't you go ahead and tell me what your first step is? Your first step is going to be adding 2/3 to both sides. Now, if you look at 5/6 and 2/3, they do not have common denominators, meaning the denominators for 5/6 and 2/3 is not the same. And remember, the denominator is the number on the bottom of the fraction. The numerator is the number on top of the fraction. So what you can do is find a number that multiplies by one or both of the denominators to get a number that they do have in common. So if you look at 3 and you look at 6, 3 actually goes into 6 2 times. So what you do to get 6 as your common denominator is multiply both the numerator and denominator by 2, which gives you 2 times 2 is 4, and 3 times 2 is 6. So you get 4/6. Now you can see that your numbers do have a common denominator. They both have a denominator of 6. Then you take your operation and just apply it to both of them. So we have 5/6 plus 4/6. So C equals 5 plus 4 is 9 divided by 6. Now, this is an acceptable answer. It is technically correct, but I would like to see you reduce it. So, if you look at what 6 and 9 have in common, they are both multiples of 3, meaning that you can multiply a number by 3 and get either 6 or 9. So you can multiply 2 by 3 and get 6. You can multiply 3 by 3 and get 9. So if you were to divide both the top and the bottom by 3, you would get C equals 3/2. Now I want you to just leave your answer like this. Okay? Just leave it as a fraction. You don't need to say 1 1/2 or 1.5 or anything like that. You should not use a calculator on this unless you are trying to use it to find a common denominator or maybe divide to reduce the fraction. But a calculator is going to give you an answer in decimals. I want your answer as a fraction. Okay? Let's look at another one. Here we have more one-step equations. This one is 4/9 k equals 3/2. So if you remember from our other one-step equations, this is multiplication. 4/9 times k. It's multiplication. So to isolate k, we are going to do the opposite of multiplication and divide by 4/9. So now, what do you multiply by that is the same as dividing by a fraction? You multiply by the reciprocal. So you get these divide and equal 1. So you're left with k equals 3/2 times the reciprocal of 4/9. Well, what's the reciprocal of 4/9? The reciprocal of 4/9, you just take 4/9 and flip it. So you get 9/4. So that means that k equals 3 times 9 is 27. So remember with multiplication, if you watch the multiplication of fractions Edpuzzle, you multiply the numerator by the numerator and the denominator by the denominator. So you're left with 27/8. And that's your answer. All right, so now you have -4/3 equals g/2. So this one, g is being divided by 2. So what's the opposite of division? It's multiplication. So we are going to multiply both sides by 2. So you have g equals -4/3 times 2. So some of you may be wondering how you multiply a whole number by a fraction. Whole numbers you can write as, I'll write this up here. So you can write whole numbers as a fraction by placing them over 1. What I mean by that is you can take 2, write it as 2/1, and that's the same thing. So, for using this example, 2 equals 2/1. Those are the same thing. So now you just multiply the two fractions the way you would any other set of fractions. So you multiply the numerator by the numerator, and you get -8, and the denominator by the denominator, and you get 3, because 1 times 3 is 3. So that's not too bad. Now let's look at two-step equations. So again, treat this the same way we would any other two-step equations, just like you did on your quiz, just like you did in previous class activities. So you say -3/4 -3/4, because remember, this is addition. You're going to do the opposite of that. So you're going to say -3/4 from both sides, and you get 1/2 x equals, and then they do have common denominators. They both have a denominator of 4. So once they have common denominators, you can apply the operation to the numerators. So 1 minus 3. What's 1 minus 3? It's -2. So now you have 1/2 x equals -2. This looks just like this problem that we did up here. All right, except this is a whole number. So we can do what we did on the last problem and write it as a fraction by putting it over 1. So now we have 1/2 x equals -2 over 1. Whenever you're multiplying by something, to undo it or to rearrange and isolate the variable, you do the opposite. What is the opposite of multiplication? It's division. So we're going to divide both sides by 1/2. Now, I'm going to ask you guys this a lot, so know it. What is dividing by a fraction the same as? Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So we are going to multiply by the reciprocal of 1/2. What is the reciprocal of 1/2? Well, you take 1/2 and you flip it to get 2 over 1. So we're multiplying two fractions. So x equals -2 times 2, multiply the numerators. -2 times 2 is -4. And then multiply the denominators. -1 times 1 is 1. So x equals -4. If you ever have an answer that is over 1, you can just write the numerator. It's the same thing. Okay, last one. So we have -2/3 y minus 1/6 equals 2/9. So what's the first step? First, you add 1/6 to both sides. Now, 2/9 plus 1/6 do not have a common denominator. So we need a number that both 6 and 9 go into. That is called the least common multiple. So we need something, like I said, we need the smallest number that they both go into. You can use any number they both go into, but it will keep you from having to reduce it more later on. So a number that they both go into. 6 does not go into 9. If you multiply 6 by 2, you get 12. Well, 9 doesn't go into 12 either. What happens if you multiply 9 by 2? If you multiply 9 by 2, you get 18. Does 6 go into 18? The answer is that it does. So if we multiply 9 times 2 and 2 times 2, we get 4 over 18 plus, and then 1/6, we need that to have a denominator of 18 as well. And we know that 6 goes into 18 3 times. So we multiply both 1 and 6 by 3, and we get 3/18. If we add them together, we get 7 divided by 18. So we get -2/3 y equals 7 divided by 18. All right. So now we can divide both sides by 2/3, which is the same as what? Multiplying by the reciprocal. Or if you said multiplying by -3/2, you would also be correct. So we are going to multiply both sides, always both sides, by -3/2. This and this equal 1. So you get y equals negative, because it's a positive fraction times a negative fraction. 7 times 3 is 21. And 18 times 2 is 36. You can now reduce your answer. So you have y equals, you need a number that 21 and 36 have in common, which they both have 3 in common. So if you divide -21 by 3 and 36 by 3, you get -7/12. And there's your answer. All right. So hopefully, as we continue, fractions will seem a little less intimidating to you guys. But for now, just look at them the same way you would any other 1- and 2-step problems.